The cold alpine air pressed against the high arched windows of the Grand Hotel, carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending snow. I sat at a small mahogany table in the far corner of the decaying lobby, my fingers stiff and aching as I carefully packed away my conservation tools. The sable hairbrushes, the small glass jars of reversible methylcellulose paste, the delicate sheets of archival kozo tissue. Each item was returned to its slotted leather roll with practiced mechanical precision. The blizzard had descended upon the Swiss pass without warning, transforming the towering peaks outside into a solid wall of blinding white. The temperature inside the grand hall was dropping by the minute. The antique radiator nearest to me hissed like a dying lung, fighting a losing battle against the freezing drafts that slipped through the warped window frames. I pulled my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders. It was not enough. My hands, pale and trembling slightly from the severe drop in temperature, moved to the center of the table. There it rested, the Finch ancestral ledger. It was a heavy, intimidating volume bound in calfskin leather that had dried and cracked over the decades, the corners rubbed raw to expose the gray binders board beneath. The scent of aging parchment, degrading sizing, and dried beeswax clung to its fragile spine like a ghost. For the last 6 hours, beneath the meager light of a brass reading lamp, I had been meticulously stabilizing the crumbling pages. The spine of the ledger had been broken deliberately. It was a petty, violent act committed by Gregory Vance's enforcers 5 years ago, when they first raided my father's gallery to collect the initial collateral. They had tossed the historical artifact onto the marble floor, as if it were trash. Since then, I had treated the book as a patient, carefully resewing the signatures with linen thread, binding the wounds of my family's failure with beeswax and silent prayers. I used a specialized bone folder, smooth and cold to the touch, to press thin layers of reversible wheat starch paste over the micro-tears in the vellum. I was a professional archivist and art restorer trained in the quiet, solitary labor of preserving the physical remnants of the past. I understood the precise chemistry of decay. I knew exactly how to halt the acidification of paper and how to mend a broken spine. But no amount of kozo tissue or archival glue could repair the systemic, structural financial ruin my family had inherited. The ledger was not just a book, it was a chain. It documented every cent we owed to the syndicate, every failed payment, every quiet humiliation. Outside, the wind howled, a low guttural sound that rattled the heavy glass panes of the Grand Hotel. The snow was no longer drifting gently. It was driving hard against the architecture, an aggressive, horizontal assault that piled up in massive drifts against the stone pillars of the entrance. The light in the lobby had taken on a bruised, purplish quality, the afternoon sun entirely suffocated by the dense storm clouds rolling over the Alpine Pass. The heavy crystal chandeliers above flickered ominously, their bulbs dimming and buzzing as the hotel's aging power grid struggled to maintain voltage against the extreme weather. I ran my thumb over the embossed gold lettering on the cover of the book. The gold leaf was flaking away, sticking to my skin like dust. I thought briefly, uselessly, about the life I had left behind in the city, the sterile transactional relationships, the high society dinners where my worth was measured solely by my family's remaining assets. My former fiancé, a man who built his career in risk management, had packed his bags the very night the first syndicate collection notice arrived at our penthouse. The distance between us never arrived all at once. It settled quietly into the villa like the morning fog that rolled in from the Pacific. It was a gradual, silent erosion of care, disguised as polite logistics and busy schedules, until there was simply nothing left to salvage. He had not shouted. He had not thrown anything in a fit of theatrical rage. He had just stopped looking at me, treating my presence as a depreciating asset he no longer wished to hold. And then, he was gone. The lobby around me was beginning to fill with a quiet, mounting panic, a sharp contrast to my own frozen stillness. Wealthy guests, clad in mink coats, cashmere wraps, and tailored ski suits, paced the Persian carpets in agitated circles. Their voices were hushed but sharp, cutting through the cold air as they demanded answers from the beleaguered staff. They spoke of missed international flights, ruined charity galas in Geneva, and the unacceptable failure of the hotel's infrastructure. I did not join them. I remained perfectly still, my posture straight, my hands folded neatly over the satchel. Panic was a luxury for people who still had a safety net. I had only the ledger, my conservation kit, and the creeping, painful numbness settling into my toes. Then the lights above flickered one final time, buzzed angrily, and died completely. A collective gasp rippled through the expansive room, followed immediately by the heavy, oppressive silence of absolute darkness, broken only by the weak, bruised twilight filtering in through the snow-caked windows. The hiss of the radiators ceased abruptly, like a machine giving up its last breath. The ambient, comforting hum of the building faded into an eerie nothingness. The cold, no longer held back by the failing heating system, rushed into the vast space with terrifying speed. I could feel it settling over the marble floors, creeping up the velvet-lined walls, and sinking directly into my bones. The temperature in the grand hall plummeted so rapidly, I could feel the moisture in my eyes begin to sting. The air turned brittle. Every breath I took felt like inhaling microscopic shards of glass. I carefully unlatched the brass locks of my leather satchel and slid the Finch ancestral ledger inside, securing it beneath a protective layer of acid-free folder stock. I could not let the dampness of the dropping temperature warp the vellum. The preservation of the document was my only remaining duty, the only tangible proof of my family's existence, before the debt swallowed us whole. I closed the satchel, the click of the metal clasps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I needed to find the concierge. I needed to know if the mountain roads were entirely impassable. The Grand Hotel des Alpes was a beautiful, decaying thing, trapped in the ice. It was a relic of a bygone era, trading on the illusion of aristocratic permanence. But beneath the heavy velvet drapes and the polished mahogany panels, the structural decay was obvious to a trained eye. The silk wallpaper in the dark corners was peeling, its adhesive long since dried out and crystallized. The floorboards beneath the thick carpets groaned with a hollow, settling resonance whenever someone walked past. It was a dying entity, masking its ruin under layers of expensive perfume and silence. I stood slowly, my knees stiff and aching from the chill. The air in the lobby was rapidly turning visible, small puffs of white breath escaping the lips of the stranded guests. A few emergency battery-operated lamps flickered on behind the reception desk, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. I picked up my satchel, the heavy leather strap biting sharply into my shoulder through the thin wool of my coat, and began to navigate through the clusters of panicked elites. They were retreating from the massive windows, huddling closer to the center of the room. None of them understood the true, clinical danger of the alpine cold. I had read the historical conservation accounts of these isolated passes. When the plows failed and the power grid collapsed, isolation was absolute, and the environment quickly turned lethal. As I approached the reception desk, the sheer scale of the logistical disaster became apparent. The mahogany counter was littered with discarded room keys, useless credit card machines, and abandoned luggage. The staff moved with frantic, silent urgency, carrying stacks of thick woolen blankets out from the back storage rooms. Emil Roth, the hotel's aging concierge, stood at the edge of the front reception desk. He was a man composed entirely of traditional manners and rigid posture, dressed in a sharply tailored uniform of dark green wool and brass buttons that now looked far too thin for the ambient environment. His face, usually an unreadable mask of bicultural politeness and calm authority, was visibly strained. Deep lines of exhaustion bracketed his mouth, and his hands, resting flat on a leather-bound guest register, trembled slightly. He was watching the temperature gauge mounted on the wall behind the desk, his jaw locked in silent worry. I stepped into the dim pool of light cast by the emergency lamp on his desk. Emil. He looked up, his weary eyes straining in the low light. Clara Finch. I was just reviewing the manifest to find you. His voice carried a thick Swiss-German inflection, heavy with the weight of logistics he could no longer control. I did not ask him if the roads were clear. The answer was already written in the thick layer of frost, creeping rapidly up the inside of the lobby's glass panes. The plows cannot make it past the lower ridge, Emil said, his tone low, meant only for my ears. The local authorities have officially closed the pass. We are completely snowed in, and the primary generators have frozen. The reservation system crashed 10 minutes before the blackout. We have lost heat in the entire lower wing, and the secondary boiler is failing as we speak. I absorbed the information with flat, clinical detachment. How long until the temperature in this lobby becomes dangerous? By nightfall, Emile replied quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor. We are moving the guests to the grand dining room. There is a large, wood-burning hearth there. It will not be comfortable, but it will prevent frostbite. We are distributing the last of the blankets now. I nodded slowly, my mind immediately calculating the risk to the fragile vellum in my satchel. The fluctuating humidity and freezing temperatures of a drafted dining room would destroy the delicate bindings I had just repaired. And the upper floors? Emile hesitated, his gaze drifting to the leather ledger bag strapped to my shoulder. He knew my name. He knew the history of the Finch family, and he knew the syndicate that held our leash. In a place like this, the staff always knew the true currency of their guests. The upper floors are completely compromised, save for one suite on the 4th floor. Room 412. It is on a separate, localized heating loop that was retrofitted last year. It is the only room in the hotel that currently has heat and running water. Then I will take it, I said smoothly, pulling a useless credit card from my coat pocket, fully aware that the lines of credit attached to it had likely been frozen by the creditors hours ago. Emile did not reach for the card. He looked at me with a profound, quiet sorrow. I am sorry, Clara. The suite is already occupied. It was reserved months ago, and due to the system crash, I cannot legally or physically compel the occupant to share the space or vacate. The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones, settling directly into my chest, tightening around my heart. Who is the occupant? Before the concierge could speak, a voice cut through the dim, freezing air of the lobby. It was not loud. It was barely above a murmur, yet it possessed a baritone weight that instantly silenced the murmuring guests nearby. The room belongs to me. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Stepping out from the deep shadows near the grand staircase was a man who seemed to absorb the little ambient light remaining in the room. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal wool suit, the fabric matte and heavy, falling perfectly over a frame that was built for violence, but trained for corporate boardrooms. A heavy silver signet ring caught the faint flicker of the emergency lamp. His face was a study in absolute, terrifying stillness. He possessed a sharp jawline, dark hair perfectly swept back without a single strand out of place, and eyes that held the cold, calculating depths of a frozen lake. He wore a heavy charcoal wool overcoat draped loosely over his shoulders, an impenetrable armor of high-status wealth and quiet menace. He did not move like a man trapped in a crisis. He moved like a man who owned the storm. Every step was measured, silent, devoid of the frantic energy that possessed everyone else in the room. Julian Vance. My hands tightened instinctively around the strap of my satchel, the syndicate head. The patriarch of the family that owned the Finch debt. The nephew of Gregory Vance. The man who had systematically dismantled my father's gallery and driven my family into ruin. Julian was a man whose reputation was built on total surgical control. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply restructured reality to suit his needs and crushed at anyone who found themselves on the wrong side of his ledger. Sir, Emile said, his voice dropping an octave in deference, completely abandoning his posture of authority. I was just explaining the infrastructural failure to Clara. I didn't realize you were standing close enough to hear the concierge's report, Julian, I said, my voice tight, trying desperately to mask the tremor in my jaw. He stopped 2 paces from me, his imposing physical weight altering the very air pressure in the cold room. I always listen, he said quietly. I just don't always respond. He looked down at my hands, which were curled tightly around the strap of my bag, my knuckles white from the strain and the cold. He knew exactly what was inside that leather satchel. He owned it. He owned me, technically, by proxy of the signature on the 3rd page of that crumbling vellum ledger. I was just another liability on his family's vast spreadsheet of power, a number to be managed. The air around him smelled faintly of cedarwood, cold rain, and expensive, dark espresso, a sharp contrast to the stale, freezing air of the lobby. You are freezing, Clara, Julian said, his voice a smooth, low rumble. He did not use my surname. The intimacy of my first name spoken in that deep, clinical tone sent a strange, involuntary shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I am managing, Julian, I replied quietly, lifting my chin. My defense mechanism had always been polite, professional silence. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. I will join the other guests in the dining room by the fire. Julian's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the only physical tell he allowed himself. He stepped closer, towering over me, his broad shoulders blocking out the frantic movement of the lobby behind him. "You have delicate circulation," he stated. It wasn't a question. It was a documented fact, likely pulled from the exhaustive dossiers his family kept on their debtors. Sitting on a hard marble floor in a drafty dining room with a damp wool blanket will not preserve your body temperature. By midnight, you will be hypothermic. That is my liability to manage, I said evenly, holding his unblinking stare. "No," he said softly, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with absolute, terrifying finality. "It is an unacceptable outcome." He reached out. I flinched. A tiny, barely perceptible tightening of my shoulders, expecting him to seize the satchel, to demand the ledger, to exert his financial dominance right there in the dark. Instead, he smoothly bypassed the bag and picked up a heavy brass key from the concierge's desk. The metal gleamed in the dim light, attached to a thick dark wooden fob. Room 412 is a suite. It has a single bed, a sitting area, and a functioning radiator, Julian said, his tone flat, entirely stripped of emotion. "You will share the space with me until the plows clear the pass." I stared at the key in his large, immaculately clean hand as if it were a weapon. Taking that key meant accepting a debt that could not be quantified in a ledger. It meant stepping into a private, sealed environment with the most dangerous man I had ever known. "I cannot pay for a share of that room," I said, my voice trembling slightly, despite my best efforts. "And I will not add to my family's debt for the privilege of your charity." "I am not offering charity," Julian replied quietly, his hand still extended, perfectly steady in the freezing air. "I am preserving an asset. Your hands restore 16th century manuscripts and delicate textiles. If you lose 2 fingers to frostbite tonight, your professional utility to me decreases. I do not allow my investments to depreciate due to poor logistics." It was a cruel transactional statement, delivered with the mechanical efficiency of a corporate auditor. Yet, as I looked into his eyes, I saw something else. A microscopic tension tightening the corners of his mouth. A rigid control that seemed slightly forced, as if he were using the vocabulary of business to mask a deeper, unspoken protocol. "I won't intrude on your space," I whispered, the cold finally winning the battle against my vocal cords. "You couldn't if you tried," he answered smoothly, his gaze briefly dropping to my shivering shoulders before locking back onto my eyes. "Take the key." I hesitated. The lobby was growing darker, the cold now a physical pain deep in my joints. If I stayed down here, I would freeze. The vellum would freeze. The last piece of my dignity would freeze. I looked at Emile. The concierge's eyes held a silent, weary apology, confirming that he could offer me no other sanctuary. I reached out and took the brass key from his hand. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was radiating heat, a shocking tactile contrast to the icy air of the room. He did not pull away immediately. He let the brief contact linger for just a heartbeat, a silent, heavy acknowledgement of the boundary we were about to cross. "Emile," Julian said, his gaze never leaving my face. "Yes, sir?" The concierge replied quickly, standing at attention. "Send whatever remains of the hot tea to room 412. Do not disturb us for any other reason unless the structural integrity of the roof fails." "Of course, sir." Julian finally broke our stare, turning his broad back to me. He adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit with slow, deliberate precision, re-establishing his armor. "Follow me, Clara. We have a long night ahead of us." I stood there for a moment, the heavy brass key pressing into my palm. The worst thing about heartbreak, I had always thought, wasn't the lie. It was hearing the truth in the voice of the person you love. But right now, standing in the freezing dark, I realized there was something equally terrifying. It was the absolute, structural silence of a dangerous man who had just decided to take control of my survival. I tightened my grip on the satchel, adjusted my collar against the chill, and followed the syndicate head into the dark stairwell. The temperature shift was a physical blow, a sudden and violent reintroduction to the concept of warmth. When Julian Vance pushed open the heavy oak door of room 412, the localized heat from the retrofitted, cast-iron radiator hit my frozen face like a sudden, forceful exhale. I stepped over the threshold, my boots sinking into a plush dark carpet that had miraculously survived the hotel's long, slow descent into decay. The heavy door clicked shut behind us, a solid, metallic thud that instantly severed us from the chaotic, desperate murmurs of the stranded guests in the freezing lobby below. The storm outside was no longer just a distant, atmospheric backdrop. It was an aggressive, physical presence. It hammered against the thick glass of the suite's French balcony doors, a relentless drumbeat of ice and high-altitude wind attempting to shatter the architecture. Inside, however, the air was entirely still, thick, and suffocatingly private. The room smelled of old, dry dust settling on velvet, polished brass fixtures, and the faint, lingering scent of cedarwood and dark espresso that seemed to emanate directly from the man standing beside me. My hyper-vigilant gaze immediately swept the perimeter, cataloging the space with the clinical detachment I usually reserved for appraising heavily damaged historical estates. The suite was vast, decorated in a fading alpine luxury. Dark flocked wallpaper peeled slightly near the crown molding. Heavy burgundy velvet drapes pooled heavily on the floorboards, and a small sitting area featured 2 high-backed wing-back chairs. But my eyes inevitably locked onto the center of the room, drawn by a terrifying gravitational pull. There was a single, massive king-sized bed dominating the floor plan. It was a heavy, ornate mahogany four-poster, covered in a pristine, stark white duvet that looked entirely out of place against the decaying, dark grandeur of the hotel walls. One bed. I stood frozen near the entryway, the heavy leather strap of my satchel digging a deep, painful trench into my aching shoulder. The realization settled over me like a secondary layer of frost, colder and far more permanent than the blizzard outside. I was locked in a sealed, heated environment with the man who owned my family's absolute ruin, and there was absolutely nowhere to hide. The geographical and emotional isolation was complete. Julian did not gloat. He did not make a crude, situational joke about the lack of sleeping arrangements, nor did he offer a condescending smile to acknowledge the deep, structural intimacy of the setup. He moved into the room with the silent, predatory grace of a man fully aware of the exact dimensions of the space he occupied. He turned away from me, facing the foot of the bed, and unbuttoned his heavy charcoal wool overcoat with slow, deliberate precision. The fabric shifted with a heavy, expensive rustle, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the quiet room. I braced myself, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I expected him to claim the space, to dictate the terms of my temporary sanctuary, with the same ruthless, unilateral authority he used to liquidate my father's remaining assets. He slipped the coat from his broad shoulders. He did not walk to the corner armoire to hang it up. Instead, he stepped to the edge of the mattress, grasped the heavy collar of the coat, and laid the massive, dark garment straight down the exact middle of the white duvet. I watched in absolute, stunned silence as he smoothed the matte wool flat against the crisp linens. It formed a rigid, undeniable physical boundary, a stark wall of dark fabric bisecting a sea of white cotton. It was a structural division of territory, executed with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a corporate merger. There was no hesitation in his movements, no lingering glance to see if I appreciated the gesture. "The left side is closest to the radiator," Julian said quietly, his back still turned to me as he made a final, micro-adjustment to the coat sleeve, ensuring the line was perfectly straight. "You will take that side. Your core body temperature needs to stabilize quickly, or the numbness in your extremities will become permanent." The sheer, absolute control of the gesture left me temporarily breathless. He had partitioned the physical space before I even had the chance to voice my anxiety, dismantling the threat of proximity without asking for a single ounce of gratitude or submission. I walked slowly toward the edge of the mattress, my legs stiff and trembling from the residual chill, and dropped my heavy leather satchel onto the floorboards. I looked down at the dark wool divider stretching across the bed. It was a clear, unspoken contract drafted in fabric. "I will not cross this line. You are safe here." I sat on the edge of the mattress, my stiff fingers resting heavily on my knees, staring blindly at the floorboards. As the cast iron radiator clanked and hissed, pushing a wave of dry heat against my damp clothes, I thought about my former fiancé. I thought about the man who had abandoned me at the first sign of financial distress, who had treated my fear as an inconvenience to his tightly managed social calendar. Because here is the thing about being tied to a man who never looked up. You forget you are a person who can be seen. Julian Vance, a man I had spent 5 years viewing as a faceless, structural monster, was currently calculating my exact physiological needs, down to the ambient room temperature and thermal proximity to a heat source. He saw everything. He anticipated every silent figure without requiring me to humiliate myself by asking for help. And standing in the heavy, pressing silence of that room, I realized that his hyper-observant nature terrified me far more than the freezing alpine storm ever could. Julian moved away from the bed, stepping into the deep shadows near the balcony, turning his gaze to the violent whiteout beyond the glass. He left me alone with the rhythmic hissing of the radiator and the slow, agonizingly painful process of thawing out. I needed to work. I needed to ground my racing, erratic heartbeat in the predictable mechanical logic of conservation. If I sat idle on the edge of that bed, analyzing the rigid boundary of his overcoat, the immense silence in the room would eventually crush me. I stood up, my joints popping in quiet protest, and moved to the small mahogany writing desk situated near the balcony doors. The brass desk lamp sitting in the corner of the wood provided a weak, amber pool of light. It was barely strong enough to pierce the heavy shadows pooling in the corners of the suite, but it was enough to illuminate the delicate fibers of my work. The desk faced the glass, offering me a direct view of the swirling, chaotic snow outside, a stark contrast to the stifling stillness inside. I carefully unlatched the brass locks of my satchel and extracted the Finch ancestral ledger. The calfskin leather binding was freezing to the touch, carrying the residual temperature of the dead lobby downstairs like a heavy physical burden. I laid the massive volume flat on the desk, treating it with the reverence of a holy relic. Then, I pulled out my secondary tool roll, unspooling the canvas to reveal my specialized instruments. The syndicate demanded an updated, meticulous inventory of the collateral bound within these pages by the end of the quarter. Gregory Vance's old contract dictated that the historical assets must be perfectly maintained, or the remaining debt would instantly double. I needed to document the recent moisture exposure and rewrite a series of fading catalog numbers in the margins before the dampness caused the old ink to bleed. My hands were still incredibly clumsy. The nerve endings in my fingertips were screaming, firing off sharp, stabbing pains as the blood flow finally returned to my extremities. Every micro-movement required immense, conscious effort. I reached into the leather roll for a small glass vial of specialized carbon ink, the kind engineered to rest on the surface of aged vellum, without bleeding through the degrading sizing. It was a rare, expensive solvent, and I only had one bottle remaining. I misjudged the distance. My shivering knuckles clipped the heavy base of the glass vial. Time seemed to slow down into a dreadful, viscous crawl. The vial tipped. The cork, loosened by the altitude and the violent temperature shift, popped free. The thick, black liquid spilled across the polished mahogany, inching rapidly toward the exposed, fragile edge of a 17th century page. I gasped, a sharp, ragged sound of sheer panic tearing through my throat. My hands froze in mid-air, entirely paralyzed by the sudden catastrophe. If that ink touched the vellum, the page would be permanently ruined. The collateral would be damaged. The syndicate would foreclose on the last remaining piece of my family's legacy. A shadow violently severed the amber light. Julian was there. He moved with a sudden surgical speed that completely defied his massive frame, crossing the room without making a single sound on the floorboards. He didn't scold me. He didn't demand to know why my hands were shaking, nor did he offer a useless, theatrical exclamation of shock. He simply reached over my shoulder, a thick, pristine white cotton towel already crushed in his grip. He had procured it from the adjacent bathroom counter in the mere seconds it took the ink to fall. He pressed the folded towel down with absolute brutal precision, forming a physical dam just 2 millimeters from the edge of the historical document. The black carbon ink pooled against the fabric, bleeding violently into the white cotton, safely absorbed away from the fragile ledger. I stopped breathing. He was standing directly behind me, so close that the ambient heat radiating from his chest completely enveloped my shivering shoulders. He didn't speak. He just held the towel firmly against the wood, his posture rigid and unyielding, waiting patiently for the capillary action of the fabric to draw up the last of the destructive liquid. As he leaned over me, his arm braced heavily against the desk. The cuff of his immaculate charcoal suit jacket and crisp white shirt rode up his forearm. I looked down, my eyes dropping to the exposed skin above his heavy silver watch. My breath caught a second time, stalling painfully in my chest. I had expected the smooth, manicured skin of a generational billionaire. I had expected the flawless hands of a man who managed empires from high-rise glass towers and air-conditioned boardrooms. Instead, the thick, corded muscle of his wrist was heavily crisscrossed with deep, jagged, silver scars. They were pale and raised against his skin, glowing faintly in the dim amber light. They were not the precise, neat surgical lines of a fencing accident or a minor high society injury. They were the brutal, layered marks of sustained, violent manual labor. The kind of scars left by grinding stone, sharp, unyielding metal, and crushing repetitive weight. I stared at his wrist, completely mesmerized by the violent topography of his flesh. The contrast between the $10,000 suit and the working-class trauma etched into his arm created a profound, disorienting cognitive dissonance. This was the ruthless patriarch of the Vance Syndicate, the man who had systematically dismantled my father's gallery. Yet his hands held the exact same physical history of exhaustion, blood, and quiet suffering as the blue-collar dock workers in my old neighborhood. He had not inherited his terrifying stillness. He had forged it, brutally, by hand. He pulled his arm back slowly, lifting the ruined towel from the desk. The silk cuff dropped immediately, concealing the evidence of his past, snapping his impenetrable armor back into place. He didn't look at me, keeping his cold gaze fixed firmly on the black stain spreading across the cotton in his hand. That's the funny thing about losing someone. It doesn't happen the day they leave. It happens in all the days you stop looking. I realized, sitting there bathed in the dim amber light, staring at the side of his rigid jaw, that I had never actually looked at Julian Vance. I had only ever looked at his name on a terrifying debt ledger. I had built a monster in my mind entirely out of paperwork, financial threats, and Gregory Vance's cruel legacy, ignoring the physical reality of the man who now stood silently protecting my work. "The document is safe," Julian said. His baritone voice dropped to a low, quiet vibration that resonated directly in the center of my chest, completely devoid of the anger I had anticipated. He stepped back, deliberately increasing the physical distance between us, returning to his side of the room. He left the silence behind him, feeling heavier, infinitely more complicated, and utterly unresolved. The cast iron radiator hissed, a sudden metallic clatter echoing within the pipes as the decaying hotel struggled against the plunging temperature. The localized heat in room 412 wavered, an immediate and terrifying physical reminder of our absolute isolation in the frozen Alps. I watched the syndicate head retreat into the heavy shadows near the sitting area, his charcoal suit absorbing the weak, amber light of my desk lamp and turning him into a sharp silhouette against the faded wallpaper. The ruined white towel remained loosely gripped in his hand, the black carbon stain stark and spreading against the pristine cotton fibers. He tossed it carelessly onto a silver tray on the low coffee table, where it landed with a soft, heavy thud. My hands were still hovering defensively over the Finch ancestral ledger, my pulse hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against the delicate skin of my wrists. I slowly lowered my fingers, pressing my palms flat against the freezing cold mahogany to force the visible trembling to a stop. The near destruction of the 17th century vellum was averted, but the structural shift in the room was permanent and irreversible. I had just seen the physical evidence of brutal manual labor etched deeply into the skin of a billionaire. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the ancient floorboards beneath my leather boots. It was the internal architecture of the grand building, slowly surrendering to the crushing weight of the ice. The water pressure inside the thick plaster walls dropped dramatically, a sound like a dying exhale. The steady hiss of the radiator sputtered, choking on trapped air, before settling into a hollow, metallic wheeze that signaled a complete systemic failure. The temperature in the suite immediately registered the catastrophic loss, a creeping, vicious chill seeping through the microscopic cracks in the aging window frames and wrapping around my ankles like an invisible shackle. Outside, the blizzard had escalated into a pure whiteout, erasing the sharp peaks of the mountains and plunging the isolated pass into absolute sensory deprivation. The heavy flakes were driving horizontally against the exterior balcony glass, like a relentless, blinding wave of pale sand intent on burying us alive. Then, a distinct, rhythmic vibration broke the tense, suffocating silence. It was a low, heavy buzz, emanating directly from the pocket of the dark wool overcoat, which still lay perfectly straight across the center of the mattress, as an imposing physical boundary. Julian turned. His posture shifted in a fraction of a second, the subtle, deceptive relaxation of his broad shoulders vanishing entirely, replaced by a rigid, predatory stillness that made the air feel dangerously thin. He crossed the room in 2 silent, fluid strides, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the plush, dust-scented carpet. He retrieved a sleek, matte black secure device from the heavy interior lining of the coat. He did not look at the glowing screen for more than a single heartbeat. The harsh blue light illuminated the sharp, ruthless angles of his jaw, highlighting a sudden, icy calculation in his dark eyes that sent a fresh wave of cold down my spine. He slipped the device back into the wool boundary on the bed, leaving the heavy coat exactly where it had been. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop instantaneously, mirroring the failing infrastructure of the hotel all around us. He was no longer just the stoic patriarch overseeing a financial asset from a comfortable distance. He was a man actively processing a tactical breach in hostile territory. In his dark, heavily structured world, a severe environmental isolation was never just an inconvenience to be waited out. It was a strategic vulnerability. The sudden loss of power and the crashed reservation system downstairs were no longer mere logistical failures to be managed by the weary concierge, Emil Roth. They were potential blind spots, structural gaps in the armor of his empire that could be exploited by unseen enemies. Julian did not issue a command. He did not attempt to manage my emotional state with abstract reassurances or loud theatrical declarations of his own authority. The kind of hollow performance the men in my curated high society world usually relied upon when their control slipped. He simply went to work with cold, mechanical efficiency. He moved steadily toward the sitting area, his tall frame completely blocking the faint, amber light bleeding in from the quiet hallway. He gripped the high back of one of the heavy oak wingback chairs. The furniture was massive. A decaying antique piece of traditional luxury built from solid, unyielding wood and thick burgundy velvet, easily weighing over 100 pounds. He lifted it slightly off the ground, his arms flexing with effortless strength, refusing to drag the wooden legs across the floorboards to avoid making even a single sound. He carried it deliberately toward the glass doors. I watched in silent, frozen fascination as the heavy muscles in his back shifted fluidly beneath the tailored fabric of his suit jacket. The sheer, raw physical power required to manipulate the massive furniture with such quiet, controlled precision was terrifying, a stark reminder of the violence he was capable of restraining. He placed the first oak chair directly against the brass handles of the balcony doors, wedging the ornate wooden back firmly under the delicate latch mechanism. It was a perfect structural blockade, executed with the surgical, calm efficiency of a man who understood the exact mechanics of forced entry and blunt force trauma. He returned to the sitting area for the second chair, hoisting it up and positioning it tightly beside the first, creating an impenetrable barricade of solid oak and heavy velvet against the fragile, frosted glass. The physical threat of the storm, and whatever tactical danger he had seen on his secure device, was systematically neutralized. He stood back in the shadows, quietly analyzing the friction angles of the chairs against the carpet, his large hands resting loosely on his narrow hips. The deep, jagged silver scars on his wrists were hidden beneath his perfectly buttoned cuffs once more. But the memory of them anchored the stark reality of the moment. Those scars told a story of crushed stone and brutal necessity, a history completely stripped of corporate glamour. The man who managed billions in abstract liabilities, who commanded an army of silent associates across continents, was currently relying on the blunt mechanics of manual labor to secure our perimeter. He was building a fortress out of a decaying hotel room, brick by invisible brick, protecting my space without asking for a single concession in return. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze sweeping over my frozen, trembling form at the mahogany desk. "You will stay away from the glass," he stated quietly, his deep baritone voice lacking any trace of panic, elevated stress, or harshness. The external locking mechanisms on these historical balconies are highly prone to failure under heavy wind load. The structural integrity of the doors is now adequately reinforced. He did not mention the secure alert that had prompted the action. He did not explain the specific nature of the danger, whether it was rival syndicates or just the crushing weight of the alpine snow. He simply absorbed the entire psychological burden of our physical safety onto his own broad shoulders, constructing a heavy barrier without demanding my panic, my questions, or my gratitude. It was a terrifying absolute form of care, disguised seamlessly as tactical management and logistical oversight. The lady. My father had once told me when discussing the ruthless matriarchs of the old syndicates, does not shoot. The lady protects. But standing in the dim light of that freezing barricaded room, watching the most dangerous man I knew secure our perimeter with his bare hands, I realized that true protection was a quiet, physical choice made in the face of absolute fear. I turned my attention back to the mahogany desk, my cold hands hovering aimlessly over the delicate, specialized restoration tools. The sharp crisis of the spilled carbon ink and the sudden, silent security lockdown had flooded my nervous system with a toxic wave of adrenaline. But as the minutes ticked by in absolute heavy silence, the chemical rush slowly faded from my blood, leaving behind a profound bone-deep exhaustion. I stared at the ancestral ledger resting quietly on the wood. The calfskin binding looked incredibly fragile under the weak bulb of the lamp, its corners rubbed raw by decades of anxious handling and desperate financial calculations. It held the meticulous records of my father's failed gallery expansions, the tragic downfall of our reputation, and the suffocating, mathematically impossible interest designed by Gregory Vance to ensure we would never, ever balance the scales. Julian moved away from the barricaded balcony, his heavy footsteps finally breaking the silence as he walked to the far corner of the room. He stopped near the hissing, dying radiator and sat down on the very edge of a small, velvet-upholstered bench. He rested his forearms heavily on his knees, his large hands clasped loosely together between his legs, his posture radiating a patient, imposing stillness that commanded the entire space. He was watching me. It was not the calculating, predatory gaze of a corporate creditor, assessing the depreciation of a liquid asset. It was the unblinking, intensely focused attention of a man analyzing a complex, incredibly fragile mechanism that he deeply did not want to break. The silence between us stretched, expanding across the large freezing room, exactly like the layer of thick frost creeping up the exterior glass. It was an oppressive, heavy quiet, burdened by 5 long years of asymmetrical power dynamics, highly formalized threats, and silent endurance. I had spent my entire adult life navigating the emotional wreckage left behind by his family's ruthless financial operations. I had smiled politely at high society galas, while wealthy patrons whispered cruelly about our ruin, hiding my trembling hands behind champagne flutes. I had quietly sold off my mother's heirloom jewelry, piece by piece, just to meet his quarterly interest demands without defaulting. I had performed absolute, unbreakable strength for a world that viewed my suffering as a mere logistical footnote in a corporate acquisition. My cold fingers brushed the cracked, degrading spine of the ledger. The tactile sensation of the old leather, combined with the faint smell of aged parchment and beeswax, grounded me, pulling my fractured mind back from the dangerous edge of a total sensory breakdown. I would not perform for him tonight. I would not sit in this freezing, isolated room, protected by his raw physical strength, and pretend that the structural violence of his inherited empire did not exist. I would not be a polite, accommodating, and useful asset, quietly accepting my own destruction for his convenience. I picked up the specialized carbon ink vial and pressed the small cork firmly back into the narrow neck. The soft squeak of the seal sounded unnaturally loud, echoing sharply in the barricaded suite. I did not turn around immediately, needing a final second to gather my fraying composure. I kept my eyes fixed on the flaking gold leaf of my family's name stamped into the cover, letting the pure, quiet anger slowly replace the freezing chill in my veins, warming me from the inside out. My father died, believing that Gregory Vance took absolute pleasure in our ruin, I said quietly, the heavy words slipping out into the cold air before my rational, self-preserving mind could stop them. My voice was low, entirely devoid of the theatrical anger, shouting, or weeping despair that usually accompanied financial devastation. It was a flat, clinical observation of a fatal wound, delivered with the terrifying calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. I turned slowly on the small wooden chair, facing the syndicate head across the length of the dark, freezing room. The heavy wool overcoat still lay perfectly straight across the center of the white duvet on the king-sized bed, a stark, physical reminder of the unyielding boundary between his violent, powerful world and my quiet, broken one. Julian remained perfectly still on the velvet bench. He did not stiffen defensively or shift his weight. He did not look away, nor did he try to interrupt me. His dark eyes remained locked on my face, absorbing the full, devastating weight of my statement, without a single flinch of denial or a desperate attempt at justification. He structured the contract so that the principal could never actually be touched. I continued, my voice perfectly steady, though my hands remained tightly clasped in my lap to hide their persistent, humiliating tremor. Every massive payment we made over the last 5 years only covered the punitive penalties and the manufactured late fees. It was a mathematical cage, built specifically for us. It was designed to slowly, methodically strip away our physical assets, our professional dignity, and eventually, our basic autonomy. My former fiancé read the updated liability terms once, packed his custom leather bags, and left his apartment keys on the marble counter of our foyer, without saying a single word to me. He told his colleagues it was simply a bad investment to tie himself to a sinking ship, a liability he refused to carry. I paused, bracing my tired shoulders, fully expecting Julian to intervene and shut down the conversation. I expected the standard corporate deflection, the cold, logical reminder that business is entirely devoid of sentiment, or a harsh command to focus my attention strictly on the preservation of the collateral resting on the desk. The men in my elite, highly curated world always interrupted women who spoke uncomfortable truths. They treated emotional vulnerability as a tactical error to be corrected, managed, or swiftly dismissed with a wave of a hand. They always filled uncomfortable, heavy silence with loud, abstract justifications of their own structural power. Julian Vance did absolutely nothing. He sat in the dim, amber shadows of the decaying hotel room, his broad shoulders relaxed against the peeling wallpaper, his breathing slow and perfectly even. He simply listened. It was not the passive, distracted listening of an arrogant man, merely waiting for his turn to speak, deflect, or issue a command. It was a profound, active containment of physical space. He was holding the room for my long-buried grief, allowing my sharp, accusing words to land in the quiet air without rushing to sweep them away or defend his family's toxic legacy. The sheer, overwhelming intensity of his focus was deeply disorienting to my fractured nerves. It made the freezing air feel incredibly thick, charged with an unspoken, heavy gravity that I could not decipher, but which held me firmly in place. "You own this ledger, Julian," I said softly, my gaze dropping briefly to the heavy silver signet ring, catching the weak light on his large finger. "You own the gallery lease down in the city. You technically own the very specialized conservation tools I use to repair these fragile pages. But you do not own the right to sit there and pretend that this is merely a logistical arrangement between two corporate entities." He wanted the absolute, quiet humiliation of the Finch name. He wanted to watch us dismantle our history piece by piece, to satisfy a massive ledger that his lawyers ensured could never, ever be balanced. I stopped, my throat tightening painfully, the freezing cold air suddenly burning my lungs as I inhaled. The thick defensive armor I had worn every single day for 5 years, the polite, professional silence I had heavily utilized to survive the high society whispers and the transactional betrayals of my peers, was finally cracking under the extreme pressure of the winter storm. The mental and physical exhaustion was absolute, a crushing weight that left me dizzy. I was so incredibly tired of preserving dead, fragile things with perfect care, while my own life was slowly decaying under the massive, suffocating weight of his family's dark empire. I looked back up at his face, my chin tilted slightly upward, stubbornly bracing myself for the inevitable crushing strike. I waited for the cold reprimand, the icy reminder of his absolute unilateral power over my future and my family's remaining dignity. Julian slowly unclasped his large hands. He leaned back slightly against the cold wall, his face catching a narrow sliver of the amber light from my desk lamp. The sharp, ruthless angles of his jaw seemed marginally less severe in the deep shadows, softened by a quiet, heavy melancholy that I had never once noticed in the sterile corporate boardroom. He looked at the heavy leather ledger resting on my desk for a long, silent moment, and then his dark gaze returned steadily to mine. He did not offer an empty, meaningless verbal apology for his uncle's targeted cruelty, knowing words could not fix the past. He did not attempt to buy his way out of the structural sin with grand financial promises, reduced interest rates, or flowery romantic reassurances that would have only insulted my intelligence. The silence stretched out between us once more, but the physical texture of it had fundamentally and permanently changed. It was no longer the oppressive, freezing isolation of a predator cornering a helpless, terrified liability. It was profoundly patient. It was a heavy, deeply respectful acknowledgement of the exact dimensions of the damage his name had caused my family. He sat quietly in the freezing dark, guarding the barricaded door against the violent storm outside, offering absolutely no excuses, simply allowing my devastating truth to exist in the space between us without a single word of defense. The ambient temperature in room 412 dropped past the threshold of mere discomfort, plunging into a sharp, clinical bitterness that actively threatened survival. The final hollow wheeze of the cast iron radiator had faded 30 minutes ago, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy against my eardrums. The frost creeping up the interior panes of the French balcony doors had thickened into opaque, crystalline fractal patterns, completely obscuring the violent whiteout, raging just inches away. The heavy oak wingback chairs remained solidly wedged against the brass handles, an unyielding physical barricade against the crushing weight of the alpine storm. But the cold was an invisible enemy. It seeped through the decaying plaster of the Grand Hotel, crawled across the plush, dust-scented carpet, and settled directly into my aching joints. Julian Vance shifted in the deep shadows of the sitting area. The subtle rustle of his tailored charcoal suit was the only warning before his massive frame broke the line of the weak amber light spilling from my mahogany desk. He did not issue a command to move, nor did he offer a hollow high society platitude about endurance. He simply walked toward the western wall of the suite, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards. Stopping before the massive, ornate fireplace that dominated the architecture of the room. It was a relic of a bygone era, featuring a deeply carved marble mantel stained with decades of old soot, flanked by two brass statues of alpine hounds. Beside the hearth sat a heavy wrought iron basket, piled high with decorative birch logs and thick dried pine kindling. He knelt on the freezing marble hearth. The fluid, effortless grace of his descent was a stark contrast to his imposing size. He reached into the iron basket, his large hands sorting through the rough bark and brittle pine needles, with a quiet, practiced efficiency. I watched from the edge of my small wooden chair, my breath hanging in the air as a pale, translucent cloud. He arranged the kindling into a perfect, structured pyramid, leaving precise gaps for oxygen flow. There was no hesitation in his movements, no unfamiliarity with the crude mechanics of building a fire. He produced a heavy brass lighter from his inner pocket. The metallic click echoed sharply. A small perfect tear of yellow flame erupted in his palm. He held it to the dried pine needles. The dry wood caught instantly with a violent, snapping crackle. The fire eagerly consumed the brittle kindling, sending a sudden, brilliant wash of dynamic gold and deep orange light across the peeling, flocked wallpaper. The thick shadows in the room were instantly pushed back, retreating into the far corners. A sharp, incredibly rich scent of melting pine sap, dry birch bark, and heavy wood smoke rapidly filled the enclosed space, completely overpowering the sterile smell of the cold, and the faint, lingering cedarwood of his cologne. The heat began to radiate outward in powerful, invisible waves. A sudden and profound physical relief that made the tight muscles in my shoulders ache as they finally began to uncoil. He did not stand up. The syndicate head remained kneeling before the open flames, his broad back to the room, watching the fire establish its hold on the heavier birch logs. The intense, dancing light illuminated the thick, corded muscles of his forearms where his cuffs had pulled back. The deep, jagged silver scars across his wrists seemed to glow in the ambient heat. They were brutal, uneven lacerations, the permanent, physical evidence of sustained trauma. Gregory was a man who measured respect entirely in the currency of terror, Julian said quietly, his low baritone perfectly calibrated to ride just beneath the snapping sound of the burning wood. He built his empire in the immaculate boardrooms of the city, using perfectly legal contracts to enact structural violence. But he did not start there, and neither did I. He picked up a heavy wrought iron poker, adjusting a burning log with a slow, deliberate thrust, Sparks swarmed upward into the dark chimney flue like captured fireflies. I was not raised in the penthouse overlooking the harbor, Clara. I was raised in the lower valleys, working the granite quarries owned by the outer branches of the family. I spent the first 22 years of my life pulling raw stone from the earth with my bare hands, breathing silica dust until my lungs burned, trading physical blood for a fraction of a minimum wage. I stared at the rigid line of his broad shoulders, my cold fingers gripping the edges of my wool sweater. The absolute, staggering reality of his confession disrupted every single assumption I had harbored for the last 5 years. I had viewed him as the pristine, untouchable heir to a corrupt throne, a man born with a silver spoon and a ledger of blood. I had never considered that the monster who inherited my family's ruin was a man who had been broken by the exact same systemic machine. When my uncle realized his legitimate enforcement networks were failing, he did not hire an external contractor, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that forced me to lean slightly forward just to catch the heavy words. He drove down to the quarries. He saw a nephew who had survived a dozen crushing tunnel collapses. He saw hands that had been torn open by raw granite and wired shut by cheap medics. He saw a laborer who understood the precise mechanics of blunt force. He pulled me from the dust, handed me a tailored suit, and instructed me to become the silent architect of his collections. He set the heavy iron poker down on the marble hearth. He finally turned his head, looking directly at me, over his broad shoulder. His dark eyes were entirely unmasked in the golden firelight, devoid of the cold corporate armor he wore in the lobby downstairs. I did not create the mathematical cage that trapped your father. I inherited it, and I have spent the last decade quietly dismantling Gregory's predatory infrastructure from the inside, burying his toxic assets, and restructuring the syndicate into something clean. The sudden introduction of dry, intense heat into the freezing room immediately altered the ambient humidity. I looked down at the mahogany desk. The fragile, 17th century vellum pages of the Finch ancestral ledger were beginning to react, the edges curling slightly upward, as the moisture was violently pulled from the ancient sizing. I stood up quickly, my stiff legs protesting the sudden movement, and carefully slid the massive leather-bound book further back into the shadows of the desk, away from the direct thermal radiation of the fire. Julian watched my frantic, protective micro-adjustments in silence. He understood the absolute necessity of preservation. He understood that my entire life was defined by protecting fragile, broken things from the harshness of his world. He looked back at the fire. The birch logs had begun to break down, the intense heat reducing the solid wood into a bed of glowing, fiercely bright hearth embers. The deep orange coals pulsed with a steady, enduring warmth, a quiet, contained power that radiated across the room. The oppressive, freezing isolation that had defined the suite just 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by a profound, heavy mutual understanding. He had not offered a defense of his family's name. He had offered me the raw, ugly truth of his own conscription. He was a stonecutter trapped in a billionaire's suit, carrying the heavy, unforgiving weight of a legacy he despised. The dead of night settled over the isolated Alpine pass, like a heavy wool blanket. The antique grandfather clock in the distant, freezing corridor outside room 412 chimed twice, a muffled, hollow sound that barely penetrated the thick oak door. The blizzard had not relented. The wind was a constant, guttural howl against the reinforced balcony glass, a relentless reminder of the lethal environment waiting just beyond our fragile sanctuary. But inside the suite, the air was remarkably warm, smelling deeply of wood smoke, old velvet, and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the man sharing the space. I sat on the far left edge of the massive king-size mattress, my back resting against the carved mahogany headboard. The heavy charcoal wool overcoat remained exactly where Julian had placed it hours ago. It lay perfectly straight down the center of the white duvet, an unyielding physical boundary that had not been breached by so much as a millimeter. He had not attempted to claim the mattress. He had remained near the fire, sitting in one of the low, velvet-upholstered benches, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth embers, his posture a steady and patient, imposing vigilance. My eyelids were incredibly heavy, the sheer emotional and physical exhaustion of the day threatening to pull me into a dark, dreamless sleep. But my hypervigilant mind refused to fully shut down. keeping my gaze anchored on the mahogany desk across the room. The ancestral ledger lay closed, the cracked calfskin cover illuminated by the dying amber light of the brass lamp. Tucked inside the center folio, pressing heavily against the restored pages, was the family debt contract. It was a thick, cream-colored document bearing Gregory Vance's sprawling, arrogant signature, and my father's desperate, trembling countersign. It was the physical manifestation of my entire ruined life. Julian stood up from the velvet bench. The sudden movement sent a spike of adrenaline through my exhausted nervous system, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. He did not walk toward the bed. He did not look at the overcoat dividing the mattress. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the mahogany desk. He stopped before the small wooden table, his massive frame blocking the amber light. He reached down with a quiet, surgical precision. His large, heavily scarred hand gently opened the heavy cover of the ledger. He did not disturb my carefully arranged conservation tools. He did not touch the fragile vellum pages I had spent hours repairing. His fingers bypassed the historical artifacts entirely, finding the thick, modern paper of the debt contract hidden in the center. He extracted the document. The heavy cream paper rustled loudly in the suffocating silence of the room, a sharp, abrasive sound that made my chest tighten painfully. "Julian," I whispered, the words slipping past my lips before my rational mind could enforce its strict protocol of silence. It was a reflexive, quiet sound of sheer panic. I expected him to fold the document into his tailored suit. I expected him to secure the liability, to audit the numbers to remind me of the exact, impossible mathematical weight of the principal we owed. He turned his head slowly, looking at me across the dim, firelit room. The shadows danced across the sharp planes of his face, emphasizing the quiet, heavy melancholy in his dark eyes. "Some ledgers," he said softly, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass the air and settle directly into my bones, were never meant to be balanced. They were designed only to break the people forced to carry them. He turned away from the desk. He walked with measured, silent steps back to the massive marble fireplace. The hearth embers were glowing a fierce, bright orange, generating a localized wave of intense thermal heat. He stood before the open flames. He held the heavy, cream-colored contract out over the fire. He did not hesitate. He did not look back at me to demand gratitude, to negotiate a favor, or to establish a new transactional condition for my freedom. He simply opened his hand. The heavy parchment dropped into the heart of the glowing embers. The reaction was instantaneous. The dry, aged paper caught the intense heat and erupted into a sudden, brilliant pillar of yellow fire. I watched, entirely paralyzed by a profound, staggering shock, as the physical mechanism of my family's ruin was violently consumed. The edges of the contract curled and blackened, the thick ink of the signature bubbling and vaporizing in the extreme temperature. The heavy legal clauses, the mathematically impossible interest rates, the punitive penalties that had haunted my every waking moment for 5 years, warped, fractured, and disintegrated into the glowing coals. A sharp, chemical smell of burning modern sizing mixed briefly with the natural wood smoke before vanishing entirely up the dark chimney flue. In less than 10 seconds, the contract was gone. It was reduced to a fragile, trembling ghost of gray ash that collapsed into the orange embers, completely indistinguishable from the burned birch bark. I stopped breathing. My hands gripped the edge of the white duvet with a crushing, desperate force. I had spent my entire adult life believing that the only way out of the syndicate's grip was through a lifetime of quiet, agonizing financial servitude. I had curated high society events, sold heirloom jewelry, and smiled through endless public humiliations just to keep that specific piece of paper from triggering a total foreclosure. And the ruthless, terrifying patriarch of the empire that owned me had just destroyed it with a single, silent drop of his hand. He did not attempt to buy my forgiveness with a grand financial gesture. He did not offer a flowery, romantic apology to absolve himself of his uncle's sins. He had utilized his absolute, terrifying structural power to execute a quiet, manual destruction of his own family's asset, setting me free without asking for a single ounce of submission in return. He stood silently before the hearth, his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching the last gray flakes of the contract dissolve into the heat. The deep, heavy silence in the room stretched out between us once more. But as I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, staring at the broad line of his shoulders bathed in the dying firelight. I realized the silence had permanently changed. It was no longer the oppressive, anxious quiet of a predator and a liability. It was the clean, patient stillness of a completely empty slate. The transition from deep, dreamless sleep to the sharp, unforgiving reality of an alpine dawn happened slowly. I opened my eyes to a ceiling of peeling flocked wallpaper, the faded floral patterns now illuminated by a harsh, blinding, blue light reflecting off the massive snowdrifts outside. The intense, localized heat that had radiated from the marble fireplace during the night was entirely gone. In its place was a crisp, biting chill that had crept back through the decaying plaster of the Grand Hotel, settling heavily into the dust-scented carpet of the suite. I was completely alone. I sat up slowly, the thick white cotton of the duvet rustling loudly in the immense, heavy silence. The right side of the king-sized mattress was perfectly smooth, the crisp linens undisturbed by any physical weight. The dark winter armor that had served as our rigid physical boundary was gone. The syndicate head had taken his heavy wool coat with him. I looked toward the sitting area, my breath forming pale, translucent clouds in the freezing air. The wooden barricade remained exactly where he had wedged it, beneath the brass handles of the French balcony doors, maintaining its structural defense against the outside world. But the violent storm itself had finally broken. The guttural howl of the high-altitude wind was replaced by a profound echoing stillness. Beyond the frosted, crystalline patterns on the thick glass, the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, the massive snowdrifts glowing like captured moonlight. In the early dawn, the blinding whiteout had surrendered to absolute, terrifying clarity. I pushed the heavy blankets aside and stood up, my boots meeting the freezing floorboards. My joints were incredibly stiff, aching with a residual cold that seemed to live permanently inside the architecture of the isolated pass. The rich scent of melting pine sap and heavy wood smoke had faded completely, replaced by the flat, sterile smell of dead, gray ash. I wrapped my thin sweater tighter around my shivering shoulders and walked with measured, cautious steps toward the western wall. The heavy wrought iron basket sat empty on the cold marble hearth. The fire was completely dead. I stared down at the extinguishing embers. Among the pale flakes of burned birch bark, there was absolutely no trace of the cream-colored paper that had held my family hostage for 5 years. The impossible interest rates, the punitive penalties, and the arrogant signature of the old patriarch had all been reduced to a fine, microscopic dust. It was scattered through the dark chimney flue by the freezing drafts, completely erased from the physical world. It was a clean, surgical destruction of history. The cage was gone. I turned my attention away from the dead fireplace and moved toward the small mahogany desk near the barricaded balcony. The early morning light was unforgiving, stretching across the dark wood like forgotten secrets. It exposed every micro-tear in the 17th century vellum, every desperate, fading pen stroke my father had made as he tried to balance an impossible equation. For 5 years, this book had been a physical weight on my chest, a terminal illness disguised as a financial obligation. My former fiancé had looked at this exact ledger once, audited the liabilities, and calmly decided that loving me was a mathematically unsound investment. He had packed his custom leather bags in polite silence, leaving his apartment keys on our marble counter without a single glance back. He had fled from the mere concept of the debt. The ruthless patriarch of the syndicate, the man who theoretically benefited from my absolute ruin, had simply knelt on a freezing hearth and burned it to ash with his bare, scarred hands. The weak, amber bulb of the brass lamp had burned out at some point during the night, leaving the workspace bathed in the stark, natural daylight pouring through the glass. My specialized conservation tools remained exactly where I had left them. The small glass jars of reversible methylcellulose paste, the delicate sheets of archival kozo tissue, and the glass solvent container were completely untouched. The historical volume rested safely in the center of the wood, its cracked calfskin cover extremely cold to the touch. And resting perfectly in the center of the embossed gold lettering of my family's name was a heavy piece of metal. I stopped breathing. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly in the freezing air, and picked it up. It was the unadorned jewelry I had seen catching the dim emergency lights in the lobby downstairs, the very symbol of his absolute, terrifying structural authority. The silver signet ring was icy against my skin, retaining the bitter temperature of the dead room. But its physical weight in my palm was immense. It was not a pristine piece of high society luxury, meant to impress investors at a charity gala. The silver was heavily scratched, worn down along the edges by years of brutal, manual friction against stone and steel. It bore the deep physical history of a man who had survived the collapsing granite tunnels before he ever stepped foot into a corporate boardroom. In the rigid, highly formalized structure of the underworld, this crest was utilized to seal international contracts, to authorize systemic restructuring, and to issue irreversible commands. Yet, he had left it sitting quietly on the cracked leather cover of a broken archivist's ledger. A leader did not leave their family crest behind by accident. It was not a forgotten accessory or a careless mistake. It was a deliberate, highly calculated transfer of power, a silent shield. Holding that heavy metal band, I realized the profound scale of what he had done. He understood exactly what it meant to be treated as a disposable asset, a functional tool used to generate wealth for a corrupt empire. By leaving the ring, he was not claiming ownership of me or establishing a new debt. He was extending an impenetrable perimeter. Any corporate creditor, any hostile associate, any ghost from the old regime who attempted to collect on my family's name would now have to bypass the man who wore the matching scars. He had not woken me to demand gratitude or submission. He had not lingered in the freezing suite to orchestrate a grand theatrical departure, nor had he offered a flowery, romantic speech to capitalize on his own mercy. He had simply executed his quiet, physical labor, burned the mechanism of my ruin, and walked out into the freezing alpine morning. The air in the suite was bitter, but the psychological atmosphere had entirely transformed. The silence between us remained, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient. I carefully slipped the heavy metal crest into the deep pocket of my wool coat. It sat there against my hip like a stone anchor, a small, dense gravity that grounded my fractured nerves. I unspooled my canvas tool roll, securing the sable hairbrushes and the smooth bone folder with the mechanical precision required by my quiet craft. The calfskin book went into the leather satchel last, secured beneath a protective layer of acid-free folder stock. The ancient volume felt significantly lighter as I hoisted the strap onto my shoulder. It was no longer a ledger of ruin. It was simply a historical artifact, returning to its proper state of quiet dignity. I picked up the heavy brass key from the polished wood of the desk. I looked back at the single king-sized mattress, the dead fireplace, and the heavy oak barricade blocking the glass. I turned the brass handle of the heavy door and stepped out into the dark, freezing corridor of the 4th floor. The stairwell was pitch black, smelling of stale air and frozen dust. Every step required a conscious negotiation with my exhausted muscles. The heavy leather strap of my satchel dug sharply into the precise line of my collarbone, a dull, repetitive ache that grounded me in the physical reality of the morning. I trailed my gloved hand along the ornate iron banister, feeling the intricate, freezing metalwork beneath my fingertips. The architecture of the Grand Hotel seemed to groan in protest against the extreme cold. As I navigated the long, spiraling descent, the massive wooden beams above me cracked sharply, the ambient moisture inside the timber freezing and expanding with a sharp, staccato rhythm. The silence of the building was absolute, a stark contrast to the frantic, panicked energy of the stranded guests the evening before. The hollow groan of the settling floorboards was the only sound accompanying my journey down into the shadows. I was walking away from the most terrifying night of my life, yet my heart beat with a slow, steady cadence that I had not experienced in over half a decade. I was not fleeing. I was simply leaving. When I reached the ground floor, the scale of the logistical disaster was fully visible in the harsh morning light, filtering through the massive frosted windows. The elite guests, those untouchable figures wrapped in mink and cashmere, who had paced the Persian carpets in frantic circles just hours before, were nowhere to be seen. The grand hall had become a frozen mausoleum. The heavy velvet drapes, hanging over the towering windows, were stiff with ice, the intricate floral patterns obscured by a thick layer of white frost. The crystal chandeliers above hung dead and useless, their bulbs clouded with heavy condensation. Behind the mahogany reception desk stood the aging concierge. He looked incredibly frail in the bright daylight, his dark green wool uniform sitting loosely on his exhausted frame. He was sorting through a stack of useless credit card slips, his hands moving with a slow automatic rhythm dictated by sheer muscle memory. "Clara," he said quietly, his thick Swiss German accent rough from wood smoke and severe dehydration. He looked up, his weary eyes scanning my face, searching for the signs of trauma that usually accompanied an overnight stay with the powerful patriarch. He found only a calm, impenetrable stillness. He did not ask how I had survived the freezing temperature of the isolated suite. He simply pulled a heavy leather-bound manifest from beneath the counter and opened it to the current date. "The emergency generators are completely dead," the old man continued, his gaze dropping briefly to the leather satchel on my shoulder. "But the local authorities managed to push a heavy plow through the lower ridge at dawn. A single transport vehicle arrived an hour ago. Mr. Vance requisitioned it. He instructed me to ensure you were safely escorted to the Lower Valley train station the moment you woke." I nodded slowly, absorbing the information with a quiet, steady breath. The stonecutter had not merely stepped out of the room. He had systematically cleared the structural obstacles blocking my physical escape. He had used his vast, terrifying logistical network not to trap me, but to carve a clean, safe path through the ice. It was care disguised as management, kindness filtered perfectly through strict corporate obligation. "And Julian?" I asked softly, my voice barely carrying over the ambient hiss of the freezing drafts. "He departed on foot toward the upper pass before sunrise," the concierge replied, his tone laced with a profound, unspoken respect. "He said the cold did not bother him. He had matters to attend to in Geneva. Of course he did." I thanked the exhausted man, leaving the heavy brass key on the mahogany counter. I turned and walked toward the massive glass entry doors. Pushing them open required all my remaining strength, the metal hinges groaning loudly against the frozen frame. The sudden exposure to the outside world was physically shocking. The alpine air was so cold it immediately burned the inside of my lungs, tasting of pure ozone and crushed ice. The blizzard had piled massive, pristine drifts against the stone pillars, burying the decaying architecture of the hotel under a flawless, brilliant white blanket. Stretching out before me was the mountain road. A massive, brutal cut had been carved through the 10-foot snowdrifts, leaving a single clear path of dark, wet asphalt leading directly down into the valley. A heavy, armored transport vehicle idled quietly near the entrance, its exhaust pluming into the freezing air like thick white smoke. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a dark, tailored coat, stood respectfully by the open rear door. He looked entirely out of place in the majestic, natural silence of the Alps, yet he moved with the same quiet, controlled discipline as his employer. He did not speak, he simply waited, bound by the strict, protective orders he had been given. I stopped at the top of the stone steps, my boots sinking slightly into the fresh, glittering powder. I reached deep into the pocket of my coat, my numb fingers wrapping securely around the cold, heavy metal of the silver crest. I had spent years performing absolute, unbreakable strength for a high society world that viewed my suffering as a mere logistical footnote. I had lived in constant, hyper-vigilant terror of the violent empire that owned my family's legacy. I had expected to be broken, consumed, and ultimately discarded by the massive gears of their structural power. But there is something quietly devastating about the way we perform healing for people who no longer deserve our pain. I had guarded my fragile independence against the wrong enemy. Sometimes the man you cursed in the darkest hours turned out to be the man who would quietly dismantle the cage, demanding nothing but your absolute safety in return. True protection was never a static contract, nor was it an empty, flowery promise spoken in a crowded ballroom. It was a daily act of choice built on mutual presence, executed with quiet, manual labor while the rest of the world slept. I looked at the driver waiting patiently in the freezing air. He did not open the door with the exaggerated, theatrical flourish of a high society chauffeur. He executed the motion with the quiet, tactical efficiency of a man trained to secure a perimeter. He recognized the heavy silver band in my hand. His posture immediately stiffened, his chin dipping in a fraction of a millimeter of absolute, unquestioning deference. I was no longer a liability on a spreadsheet. I was untouchable. No cover stories, just a clean, newly plowed road and a heavy silver ring promising that no one would ever touch my family's legacy again. I tightened my grip on the metal, stepped out into the blinding alpine sunlight, and began the long, quiet descent toward home.